the one, the man of the hour, Michael Maloof. Michael Maloof is a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of Secretary of Defense, author, and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 30 years of federal service in the U.S. Department of Defense, and he is a damn good friend of the show. How you doing, Michael? You doing all right this morning?
So far, so good. Thank you, Tomorrow. I hope you are
man.
too.
Thank you for joining me, man.
Sure.
I was telling the audience, I was going into the story from Kirill Budanov, and this came out in one of the papers in Ukraine, and apparently he was in a meeting. They were having some kind of meeting talking about the military campaign, the war. And right here it says, quote, somebody asked them, how much time do we have left? Budanov responded with a cold smile, quote, if there are no serious negotiations by the summer, very dangerous processes could begin for the very existence of Ukraine, unquote. So the spy chief, the man who likes the darkness, I believe as Newsweek pointed out, he is effectively saying the most honest thing in the world that none of them would typically, under normal circumstances, say. 6 months, at least by the summer, something needs to take place to change or at the very least stop the intensity of this war. Otherwise, the existence of Ukraine itself is at stake. And this is obvious. I think, like, if you're looking at the speed at which, like, if you're thinking of Bakhmut, for example, Bakhmut took months for it to crack. Avdiivka took months for it to crack. But it seems that the speed at which Russia is moving is accelerating, and the ability for Ukraine to resist is being diminished. And this has been, it's obvious at this point. Give me your take on this. I mean, for one, is Budanov correct? There's that. And I want you to give me your take on this, juxtaposed against this notion of now we need you to send your kids to war also. So not only is Budanov, the spy chief, effectively saying the quiet part out loud, in 6 months, if we don't do anything major, this is going to collapse. But we also are telling people that we now need you to send your 18-year-olds into a losing war. It's just astonishing. Give me your take on this.
Well, there are a number of considerations. Number one, on the Ukraine side, they are losing dramatically. They can't keep up their mobilization. They are, and already the United States has frozen foreign aid to Ukraine, and that may include, if it isn't already in the pipeline, even the ordnance. So I think the message is becoming clearer and clearer. Now there's another consideration, and I had a Russian diplomat point this out to me the other day. Ukraine had passed a law saying they will never negotiate with Russia.
Right.
That needs to be rescinded. Even though Zelensky, whom the Russians no longer recognize as the legal head of Ukraine, has said he's willing to negotiate finally. But you know, you still have the Rada, the Ukrainian Rada, which is still has empowerment and authority in the legitimate government of Ukraine. I think what the Russians are suggesting is that we're bringing this to closure, and I think that they're also feeding off a little bit of from Trump's desires to want to get this conflict ended quickly and soon, because in meantime you have the other Western countries that want to have some kind of a bilateral security relationship, wanting to basically assist Ukraine, but I think that's a cover for them wanting to take back ancient territories that their own own citizens used to occupy back in the 14th, 15th century.
So Poland and Lithuania.
Yeah. The question is, will Ukraine as an entity, as a nation state, exist much longer? And I think that even the Europeans are getting pretty fed up, and instead they want to pick the carcass. It's like in the Zorba the Greek movie, they were waiting for the old woman to finally die, and as soon as she did, all the local residents just came in and took all the possessions, you know. So
yeah. I mean, but they're at the point of saying, send in your kids. I mean, like I'm saying kids because from my point of view, an 18-year-old is effectively a child.
Well, they're
But
talking 15 to 18.
that's astonishing. I mean, like,
Yeah, I agree.
it's mind blowing to me that two of these things can exist simultaneously. A, we're going to lose the war, meaning our military may collapse. Hell, the government, meaning the very existence of Ukraine, is at stake within 6 months. But we also need to send kids into the war zone, into a losing war. That is so grotesque to me. Let me
Well,
actually, do you,
I,
no,
I
please.
think I think at this point, Ukrainians themselves now have got to rise up and say, enough of this stuff. The war is over. You've lost. And you're going to lose more territory. And the Russians are going to undertake a major offensive if they haven't already. I think they've already begun, frankly. And all the critical areas now where the hubs are in Ukraine proper are vulnerable because the Russians now are in a position to take back more territory, and they can continue doing that, particularly in the Russian-speaking areas, and that it would include Odessa, um, and Kharkov, and in all these areas where there's still Russian-speaking people. In the meantime, in Western Ukraine, you've got Polish-speaking people, you got Lithuanians. They all want their old citizens back, and already you have these NATO countries basically using NATO to exercise their ancient desires to retake lands that once belonged to them back in the 14th, 15th century.
Let me ask you this. If Ukraine was in charge of their own military, do you think they would be going this far? And what I mean by that is, if the United States, let's say Vietnam, let's use Vietnam as an example. The US goes into Vietnam. The US is fighting that war for X number of years, and we lose, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of people that we lose in the war, or tens of thousands, I forget the exact number. But at some point, the US makes this choice, all right, we need to cut our losses, and we're going to leave because we have all of these people that are dying. We're unclear in regards to what we're going to get out of it, and we're even unclear on what a win looks like in the situation. So we are leaving, we're pulling out. But what would have happened if the US military wasn't making that choice, or the US president wasn't making that choice, but a foreign government was making that choice? Well, if a foreign government is making that choice, that foreign government is going to care less about the fact that American soldiers are fighting and dying, and they may be more inclined to keep American soldiers in there far longer than what the actual government would do, that government being ideally having a responsibility to the soldiers that are fighting in that war. And I guess I'm saying from the Ukraine standpoint, it has been a very bizarre war because a lot of it has been a propaganda war because they're getting so much money and resources from outside the country. They had to effectively show what the money was being spent on, even when it wasn't to the best interests of Ukraine. Give me your take on that. I mean, if Ukraine was fighting this war on their own, and let's postulate for the moment that they're able to fight the war on their own, do you think they would continue and have gone this far in the fight? Or do you think they would have tried to come to some kind of terms by now?
I think based upon the hypothetical assertion that you made, I think the Russians probably would have just steamrolled all over it. I think Russia has been somewhat restrained because of NATO and because of the United States.
Mm.
And if those other countries were not participating, I think Ukraine would have gone down some time ago. And it's only been because of the continued support. Look, they had to get outside support because they couldn't do it on their own. So
Right.
that tells you volumes.
No, that's a good point. No, that's a good point. The fact that these other countries were involved on some level is a restraint. It Russia doesn't want to
Yeah,
go too far too fast because they don't
right.
necessarily want to create a pretext to get involved further into the war. No, that's a
Yeah,
good point.
because you see these other countries, and I think you're going to see Trump exercise this. I'm theorizing, but I think he's going to be looking more at the. I hope he does at least more of the geostrategic, geopolitical outline of what's to come, and realize that Ukraine on its own is incapable of coming to its own conclusions, and that it's only been there at the behest of the West. And if you take that away, they have no choice. And that's why I think the Ukrainian people themselves now need to rise up. They need to take back their government. They need to have new elections. They need to get a new president and get back into constitutional governance and basically work things out. They're going to be a shell of what they were. The Russians will not give that back Luhansk, Donetsk, or even Odessa, which I think is going to be next. And I think the Ukrainians who are left are realizing that, especially those who are about ready to be drafted again. And you got all these other millions of Ukrainians who are not even in the country any longer. So, they have no intention of going back. So what does that tell you about the integrity of that nation as a nation state and its longevity? Doesn't say much. It doesn't. Yeah, it's time. It's time.
Yeah, it's a dying country.
And I think what the Russians have purposely done now, in given the constraints, is basically undertake a war of attrition, so that it comes to a natural conclusion, and it takes someone like Trump to come on the scene, who's brand new, and because none of the European countries have any credibility, so they're because they have their own little petty historical interests, and the Russians aren't going to settle for it. They, at a minimum, there's got to be a guarantee that Ukraine, if whatever exists of Ukraine, does not become a member of NATO, and that it remains non-aligned. Period.
WAPO wrote the story saying something to the fact, and I'm paraphrasing, that it would be better for Ukraine to effectively collapse on the battlefield than make a bad deal. Now, this story is outrageous. I mean, they're effectively saying that, fight to the last dead Ukrainian. That's a better option. What is it that Trump wants? Meaning, and I know a deal, but I get the sense that what Russia wants is a larger security architecture of Europe. Is there a middle ground in those things where there's a win-win within that? Meaning Russia gets this kind of new security architecture of Europe, and Donald Trump gets to close the war, where he could say, I said I was going to end the war, I'm going to end the war. And what does that look like? What does that middle ground look like? If you had to thread that needle to get what both sides actually want, is it possible to do it?
I think so. I think Trump's got to make it very clear that NATO is no longer going to be an expansionist alliance, that in fact it's going to be going back to its original defensive nature, that it's not going to be agitating and creating these conditions under which it threatens the Federation. He's got to make that clear, because his notion of peace through strength is of course to have the best military in the world, but that doesn't mean you have that military going around trying to conquer everything. Right. It's meant to protect the vital national security interests of the United States. Ukraine is not one of those, and the Europeans have got to consider that they have lost. Even all of NATO put together, except for the United States involvement, could not stand up to the Russian military at this juncture. They just wouldn't have it. They just couldn't do it in a sustained way, and that's the key: sustained way. And now the world is much more dangerous, because under Trump 1, he got rid of the intermediate range ballistic missile treaties, and those need to be reestablished. There's got to be a way to try to create an atmosphere of trying to lessen the tensions in that part of the world and redevelop trust. Right now, trust between Russia and the United States is virtually nil. And what the Russians are very concerned about is that Trump is going to fall back on listening to his old advisors, such as Kellogg, who's a neocon,
Hmm.
and Fred Fritz, in these characters that got us into this mess in the first place, and we're trying to push the whole expansionist policy toward the Russian up to the Russian Federation, and they're still talking that way toward China. So, and that's what in turn what has drawn Russia and China together. So when you look at it in a geostrategic and geopolitical framework, uh, our policy for years has been a failure.
Let me
And
ask you this.
he's got to wake up and recognize that.
Does Trump have any leverage over Russia at all?
Yeah. Well, he has leverage in the sense that he has made it clear. He has these people around him to get their advice, but he ultimately makes the ultimate decision. You didn't have that with Biden. And Biden always read from whatever talking points were handed to him. Trump is a different species in that regard. And
Well, no, please. I'm sorry.
and we saw this, and we're seeing this now in his relationship, even though it's behind the scenes with Netanyahu. He will not want to invade Iran as Netanyahu wants to do, and he wants to take care of the problem. But interestingly, Trump has never addressed as such the issue of the Palestinians, the fate of the Palestinians. Okay, yesterday he talked about putting them in Egypt and Jordan. Those two countries have already summarily rejected that notion, and yet he has no other solution. His idea is, well, let's work to expand and have economic opportunities in the Gaza, and if Israelis want it to make condos and beachside fronts, that's the direction he wants to go. Never mind that that's land the Palestinians have occupied for what, 2 millennia?
Yeah.
2 millennia. Even Hadrian, when he was the Roman emperor, was in that area. He spoke of the Palestinian area in relation to the occupation of Syria by the Roman armies. And this, it isn't like you hear from Newt Gingrich that, well, the Palestinians are just a figment of the early 20th century. No, they've been around for 2 millennia.
Well, I guess it brings up another question. What move into that since we ended up on this topic? Egypt and Jordan has said no. In fact, they told Joe Biden no. I mean, even before Donald Trump got around to this particular policy proposal, they had already told Joe Biden no, and they had ruled it out completely. But considering that both of these are clients of the United States, I mean, Egypt gets a ton of money from the United States, if I'm not mistaken, so does Jordan. Does Trump have a level of influence that Joe Biden was just not willing to wield? Like, because if you think about it, the Netanyahu thing, Joe Biden, we were giving Israel like 70 to 80% of all of the money and resources that they were spending to propagate this genocide. And at no point did Joe Biden use any of the political clout or financial clout, or for that matter, the military armaments to compel behavior, or at the very least push behavior one way or the other. Donald Trump wasn't even in office yet and was able to make, or at the very least get a ceasefire, at the very least stop the overt large-scale killing, even though the killings were still taking place. So if we use that as a model, do you think there's any chance that Donald Trump has the capability of pushing, cajoling, threatening Egypt and Jordan into accepting Palestinians?
He can cajole. I don't think they can handle it economically, number one. But number two, it's not what the Palestinians want. And it would also represent overcrowding. And even in Jordan itself, the population there doesn't want them. Right. They have them. They've got Palestinian camps, But why haven't they released the camps and integrated those folks into mainstream life there? No, they've maintained these camps. They don't want them, and they would have to house them and take care of them, and economically they cannot afford it. The United States cannot afford it. The United States cannot afford to underwrite them, either country. So it's an entirely different picture than when Trump was in office the first time. And you also have, since Trump was in office the first time, renewed relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So the question is, why do we need a U.S. presence in that region, and to continue that?
Yeah.
When the United States, when these two countries or entities representing Sunni and Shia are no longer in conflict, open conflict with each other, at least, except for the radicals, and we're not our influence in that region has basically greatly diminished, and you also have new stipulations by the Saudis that if they want normalization with Israel, they want to renew the Abraham Accords, then there has to be a recognition of the two-state solution for the Palestinians.
Do you believe that, though? I mean, Saudi Arabia, up to this point, at least the ruling elite in that country, has shown no propensity, or let's say concern, about the Palestinian cause. I mean, yes, the population does. I didn't get the sense that the government did. But give me your take on this. I mean, do you think they actually are going to stand by that, or give a year or two and they come back around to the deal? How do you think this is going to pan out?
I guess everybody has a price, but what is it that the United States has to offer at this point, that the Saudis couldn't just buy outright? What leverage would the U.S. have? I think, and it's been the Crown Prince himself who has insisted on the two-state solution, not just the population. Yeah. So even though the Saudis and the other Arab countries won't take in the Palestinians because they feel that they have a right to that region, and the problem is that you've got Netanyahu, who's trying to undertake this biblical thing, a Masonic notion of retaking all of these ancient lands that the Palestinians have occupied, including Gaza, including West Bank, and it's always been Palestinian, and they somehow feel that it rightfully belongs to them, referring back to some 3,500-year-old notion that God gave the Jews that right. No, they didn't. Most of the Israelis today are from Europe. They're not indigenous. They're not indigenous. They're mostly out of Europe as a result of the consequences of World War II. And we need to, again, our policymakers need to know and understand history before we go off trying to come up with new policy directions. And what I'm very concerned about, and this is one of the points I wanted to raise, I've heard Trump in very recent days spout off what he considers to be facts, not only on the number of dead, for example, in the Ukrainian conflict, but also he has no notion of any history of Middle East history. And he's only spouting off what the intelligence community has given him, and he has no other basis of fact to rely on, no other reference. And what I'm very concerned about is that they're going to purposely give him misinformation in a way to justify their direction of the way U.S. policy should go. And as a consequence, they purposely, because of the animosity between Trump and the deep state / intelligence community, I think they're purposely setting him up for failure, just as they did Bush 2 toward Iraq.
Now, what would failure look like in this? It would be not having a peace deal, ended up in a larger war with somewhat like Iran. What would be failure for Donald Trump on
Well,
this?
that's part of it, but not coming up with a resolution finally on the two-state solution.
I see.
Right? It just got. We have internet. We have UN resolutions. It's U.S. policy that two-state solution is the way to go. The UN resolutions continuously have stated that, and how do we ignore that and not recognize that when you have people who want to push the agenda of supporting Netanyahu, who's really out on a limb. His own future is in great jeopardy, and yet you have our intelligence community and deep state folks really pushing to protect him and keep him in office and supply him the weapons that he needs. Toward what end? We're trying to resolve this, not create new conditions for further weapons. So why did Trump agree to the 2,000-pound bombs going to Israel? What's he going to bomb? Who is he going to bomb?
I mean, give me your take on that. I mean, look, from my point of view, Donald Trump was completely obsequious to Israel. I was even shocked that he did the ceasefire.
Even that is riddled. I mean, he says all hell's going to break loose. What do you mean all hell's going to break loose? What are you going to do? How are you going to implement all hell breaking loose? How are you going to implement it? Who are you going to bomb? A bunch of kids and women in tents? It's nonsense. It was just one of those flamboyant, bombastic outbursts. And when you stop and think about it, you think, well, what do you mean all hell's going to break loose?
Yeah.
Maybe he ought to point that more in the direction of Netanyahu to have him overthrown or replaced and put in a government that's more reasonable and willing to work with the Palestinians.
Well, speaking of that, how do you think this ultimately, Donald Trump says something that I take it to be true, even though I don't necessarily know what it entirely means. So he pointed out that Gaza has been fundamentally destroyed, that there's like nothing there. And you have these videos with people in these very long lines, look like almost like a kilometer of people walking back to their homes, even though their homes no longer exist. I mean, 70 to 80% of all of the territory has just been flattened in northern Gaza. All of the hospitals are gone. And of course, Israel did that on purpose, right? If I don't want you to be here, then I don't want you to get food. I don't want you to get medical treatment. I don't want you to have a home. I want to remove all of that so you don't come back here. They were trying to ethnically cleanse the area. All right, fast forward. All of these people are effectively walking back, and I suppose they're just going to put up tents and they're just going to be wherever they are. That is clearly untenable, right? Or am I wrong in this?
No, it is untenable. There's nothing permanent going to be. Where's the reconstruction? Look, they have this 3-phase ceasefire. It's not going to get past phase 1. I'm going to tell you right now, because what phase 2 calls for is the evacuation of all Israelis out of Gaza. That ain't going to happen. That isn't what the Israelis want. They're basically saying that they will continue to occupy and basically take it over. And with Trump talking about, well, trying to invest in the area, which implies working with Israelis, I don't see any resolution. And you already have Smotrich, even though Ben-Gvir has left the government, Smotrich, who has another 6 members or so in his party, keeping the Netanyahu government afloat. He's basically said, "Look, I'm going to walk too if you don't resume the war.
Basically,
Where are
the
we
government
going
is going
with
to do that.
this?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I don't.
if he listens to Trump and cuts off any further hostilities, then Netanyahu's government falls. Netanyahu cannot afford to be out of government right now. He's got that court case. He was just in court late last week or early this week. Also, he's physically got issues. He has personal medical issues, which are very serious. So he really cannot. He's really between the rock and hard place in many respects. So and so his government is on the verge of falling if he decides to enter into phase two and evacuate. He has talked about the whole notion of ethnic cleansing, doing away with anybody who's not Israeli, claiming that they are humans, but or animals, but in human form. They're there to serve the Israelis. It's mind-boggling, and this is why that whole biblical notion that he's undertaking makes him an extremist in terms of his interpretation of the Old Testament and the Talmudic codes, and as a result, he's no different than ISIS in its interpretation of the Quran.
Do you think that is that mine or okay? Do you think that Trump and Netanyahu agree on what's taking place in the Middle East? Like, meaning, do you think it's? I can't get my head around Trump on this stuff. In one sense, he played the Jeffrey Sachs video. In another sense, I've had the clip of Donald Trump talking about, basically saying Netanyahu doesn't want a deal, that Abbas did want a deal. And so you have these sober moments of Trump that comes up where he is saying something that just so happens to be true. And in that Jeffrey Sachs video, he said Netanyahu was a deep, dark son of a bitch and was responsible for the United States going to war in Iraq. Okay, if Trump is putting that out there, I have to question, okay, well, this is clearly rattling around in his mind. This is something that he, at the very least, knows. And so, despite the fact that he's been given all of this money from Miriam Adelson, some of these other Zionists or whatever, in order to take a certain hard tact in Israel's direction, do you think if he could get something, he would actually want a deal? Meaning he would want a way to put this to bed in real terms? Or do you think, no, he really is just a Zionist who's obsequious to the Israeli government, whatever the Israeli government wants? How do you view this? Because the reason why I ask this, because it gets into what happens going forward. You pointed out that you don't believe that this is going to go to the second phase of negotiations, that for all intents and purposes, that Israel is just going to resume the war. That would be atrocious, even though that is what Netanyahu has said, effectively saying that Trump and Joe Biden has given them assurances that they can resume the war once the hostages are released. How do you view this? Do you think that there's going to be any pressure at all on the Netanyahu government coming out of Trump that wasn't there under Joe Biden in order to stick with the deal?
Well, I would hope so, because even Miriam Edelman has issues now with Netanyahu.
Does she?
Yes, she does. She's and apparently their families are not getting along. So so I think her perspective is a little different. I'm hearing that she supports Bennett as the new prime minister, and
Really?
so that raises some interesting new perspectives. And as long as you see what Netanyahu has basically done is to set up a conflict for himself, in that he talks about a phase 1, 2, and 3, which would call for not only the Israelis leaving the Gaza, but also to reconstruct for the Palestinians. Well, but at the same time, he he wants to go ahead and continue all the bombings and what have you, and he needs to keep that government intact if he wants to survive politically. So there's conflict even within, and I think that we see a major conflict within the Israeli government itself on the direction to go. I don't think he has any intention of living up to a permanent ceasefire.
Yeah.
And I think that he's, even though he negotiated one, I think it's just window dressing. And he also has Smotrich basically saying, if you go beyond phase one, then I'm walking.
I mean, but if you're right, and there's no intention of going to the second phase of negotiations,
Right.
then you can promise anything that you want, you know.
Sure, that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
And here we're getting sucked back into it, and we should be basically telling Netanyahu it's your problem, and Netanyahu wants to go to war against Iran. We can't abide by that. Not Trump wants to get out of all of that. He wants to stop wars, not create new ones. If he continues supporting Netanyahu, he's basically giving Netanyahu carte blanche and once again ruling the roost on direction of policy of in terms of the having events control Trump. Trump doesn't operate that way. Trump wants to be in control. And the only way you do that is to seize control yourself and do something about it rather than have an outside power such as Netanyahu try to dictate terms, as he did back in 2018 when he told Trump to drop out of JCPOA. And that created all the problems that we have right now.
I guess I think I've asked this question with Joe Biden, but I don't think I've asked this question with Trump. Is this the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail?
Well, it's getting to be the tail wagging the dog, and the dog has got to understand that, the dog being Trump, the tail being Netanyahu, and Netanyahu needs to be. It's just like when you're a puppy, the older animals will put them in their place, and they know where they stand. And Trump needs to do that immediately, and that's what we're seeing a little bit behind the scenes with the release of that Sachs video, and with Miriam Edelman now being very opposed to Netanyahu. Yeah. Even though she wants Trump to
annex West Bank.
to annex the West Bank. Again, at some point you got to say enough. And if he wants to deal with the Saudis, you don't do that, and you don't let Israel annex the West Bank and then try to come up with a two-state solution. I mean, this doesn't make sense.
Oh, you're so right. No, you're so right. Yeah, you're so right. I mean, because the reality of it is,
policy? Where's the clear policy direction on this? There is none. That's why Trump needs to get in control, needs to grab the initiative, and needs to dictate. Here's our terms. If you don't like it, we're leaving, and you're on your own.
Do you see that happening?
It could, unless the Israelis themselves take action and change things.
And also, what is the issue with Adelson? Is it that she's concerned that Netanyahu has overextended Israel? Or, I mean, because that woman is just as much of a fascist as pretty much anybody else in Israel.
I don't know exactly what her issues are, but I'm hearing on the grapevine that they have issues. And I don't know precisely what the issue is with Netanyahu, but Netanyahu has managed to isolate himself against everybody, even Trump, and that's quite something. Wow. It's got. By the way, I've got another thing coming up shortly, so if we can wrap.
No, totally understand. No, we can close it on this. No, look, man, I always appreciate the time that you give, and I always appreciate your take. It's really appreciated.
Well, I hope it helps, because I'm still trying to understand it myself, because it's so fluid, and I don't think either. Certainly, Trump does not have a well laid out policy direction that he wants to pursue. We know he doesn't want any more wars, but he doesn't want to get sucked into one that's going to be even greater and it's going to make it much harder to get out of, such as going after Iran. And I think he's also got some quiet channels now opening up to Iran.
Somebody else said that too, that he's working behind the scenes, like in the same way it took Nixon to go to China, it takes somebody like Trump in order to kind of make this deal.
Well, you've had Elon Musk. You've had Elon Musk visiting twice. I'm told that his biological father was Iranian.
Really? I mean, it would smooth any kind of back channel negotiations. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, it would be interesting.
Yeah, Michael Maloof. Thank you, man. I really appreciate it. Michael Maloof, he's a former senior security policy analyst in the office, of Secretary of Defense. He's an author and regular contributing analyst on RT and other media outlets. He has nearly 20 years of federal service experience in the U.S. Department of Defense. Have a good one, my man. Be safe.
You too. Thank you, Jamal.